everybody, and welcome to Your Next Great Read from the Okie Bookcast. I'm Jay Hall, and I'm on a mission to connect curious readers like you with your next favorite book, and that's what this show is all about. We're going to be talking about books we love and giving you reasons to love them too. The goal of the conversation is to introduce you to a ton of great books and hopefully connect you with a few that you're going to love. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, author, screenwriter, and favorite oldest daughter, Hannah Herron. Hannah, what's up?
What's up, guys? Good to be back.
We're back.
We are back, man, and it is good. I'm excited.
It's been 3 months. I don't even know.
Yeah,
I think the last time we did this one.
I think February was our last recording.
Hiatus is over. Came back last week with the first new interview and have made the decision, at least for a little while, that we're going to go every other week instead of every week, which means that Next Great Read, instead of coming out on the fourth Tuesday of the month, is now going to come out on the third Tuesday of the month. Not only are we back, this is also momentous because this is the last recording from the original closet.
Hey, he's moving.
That's right. We're moving this weekend, which means new closet. It will still be in a closet, but a different one, a bigger one that will actually be dedicated to mostly just this, so I won't have to move around my son's sweatshirt. So we're very excited about the possibilities of things ahead.
This is huge.
But,
the expansion.
This is big stuff. The expansion. The worldwide studios are getting ready to explode. So anyway, all of that is nonsense, and we're here to talk about books. So let's talk about books, because we did take 3 months off, and there are lots of books that we also wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about. We don't have a guest this week so that we can add a couple more books in. So you're going to walk away with plenty of recommendations, just one less voice than you usually hear on Your Next Great Read. So with all that said, Hannah, remind everybody of the format. What's the plan?
All right, guys. So let's do a quick reminder of how this conversation is going to go. So we're going to talk about our books in 3 rounds. The first round is going to be a book that we're currently reading. We're going to give you our early impressions on it, tell you what we think from the get-go. Then we're going to talk about 2 books that we've read in the last 30 days or so. We'll give you a quick review and recommendation on those. We'll end our conversation with our backlist pick, and this is 1 book each from a pre-assigned category. It has to have been released at least 5 years ago. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and kick off round 1.
Are you ready to be jealous?
Am I?
I am currently reading Stephen King's brand new short story collection called You Like It Darker.
I knew you were going to say that.
I knew you'd be jealous. Well, okay, so it's a short story collection. The current story that I'm reading is 150 pages long.
That's a novella. That's not a short story. I mean, I'm not here to tell Stephen, how to live his life.
Right.
But
no, that's as long as a lot of the science fiction novels from the 40s, 50s, and 60s that I read all the time. Now, having said that, Stephen King did write The Stand, which is 1,200 pages long. So for him, perhaps 150 pages is a quote-unquote short story, but I'm here to tell you, ain't nothing short about it. That said, this is his brand new collection, 12 new stories. Some of them have been published in magazines before. Most of them have been previously unpublished, so it's brand new material that nobody's had a chance to read. The whole thing about You Like It Darker is this idea that he says in the afterword that you like it darker, so do I, so we're going to push things a little bit. That hadn't happened yet. I think I'm 4 stories in. It is classic Stephen King short story writing. And Stephen King is an unbelievable storyteller. Everybody always thinks about him in terms of horror, and we've talked about this before. He's just a fantastic writer. And so in every genre that he has tackled, he has done really interesting things. And no exception in these short stories. And if you think back through a lot of his short stories, they're not all Cujo, right? They're not all The Shining. There is a lot of short story stuff that is kind of his early attempts at, potboiler detective stories or mysteries or things that aren't quite things go bump in the night as some of his other stuff. And this has a little bit of that. There's an alien story, and there's a weird dream leads to things story. And apparently one of the stories has a connection to Cujo, which I'm kind of excited about getting into that. If you are a fan of Stephen King, you're going to get in, and this is going to be exactly what you always want from him. But I will say, if you're not a fan of Stephen King or you're curious about him and you haven't read very much, I think the short stories are a great place to start because you get a feel for his style because it's him across all of it, whatever he's writing. But it's not some of the scarier, gorier. You're not as committed. You can always just turn the page and move on to the next story if the one that you're reading isn't for you. So I think short story collections, I think this one certainly, are a great way to introduce yourself to King and then get ready because there's probably an addiction coming. But yeah, you like it darker, his new collection of short stories, loving it so far.
I'm so glad to hear that. I love his short stories. There's such a misconception out there that you're either a novel writer or a short story writer. And Stephen King goes to show that that's not necessarily true, right? Like there are people who can do both. And it just comes down to storytelling. I mean, like you said, he's just a phenomenal storyteller across genres, across different lengths of stories, whether it be, 150 pages or 1,200 pages. He can do it all, right?
Or 10 pages. Because I think that's one of the, I wonder, and watch me critique Stephen King here for a moment. I wonder if part of the reason his short fiction is so good is because it's limited. And he has to, like a lot of short stories kind of drop the surprise at the end or drop the twist at the end and then, might drop fade to black. And when you don't have a page limit and you can just keep writing, I think some of the critique of King is that he keeps going.
Yeah, that is.
That it's too long. There's things you don't necessarily need. And when you're trying to write short stories, you're trying to write 7 or 10 page stories, you have to be tight.
Right.
And you have to just kind of remove the fluff and really get to the heart of what you're trying to say. And I think that may be why some of this is really effective.
Yeah, I think you could absolutely be onto something there. His short stories, and like you said, they're such a good place to start if you're introducing yourself to Stephen King. Start there. Don't start with It, which is 1,000 pages. Start with
right.
Something short. His novellas are fantastic too. I think it's his 4 Before Midnight. That's the series of the 4 novellas. Those are fantastic. I'm glad to hear that it is on par with the other short fiction he's done.
What about you, Hannah? What are you reading?
Well, so are you prepared to be jealous? Because
I am.
I have also got my hands on something that just came out. In fact, it came out today, and I'm already a quarter of the way through it.
No way.
Don't ask me how, because I do have a job and I did work it today, but I also managed this. Paul Tremblay's new novel, Horror Movie, dropped today, and I am eating it up. So
that's awesome.
You guys know I love Paul Tremblay. My dad introduced me to him. Gosh, what was that? Coming up on 3 years ago or so. Yeah. With I think Head Full of Ghosts was the first of his that I read. But then, of course, it spiraled into all of his other work because he's just amazing. He's a fantastic horror, thriller, mystery writer. Horror Movie is a kind of a take on the cursed film genre that is kind of reemerging in novels. Like The Ring was kind of the first to kind of popularize that trope. But this is a novel about an indie horror film that was filmed about 30 years prior. And the movie never actually made it to the screens. Okay. Only 3 scenes from this film were ever shown publicly. That with a couple of still shots from the filmmaking process. And so the movie never actually saw the light of day. Only one of its actors is still alive. Okay. So fast forward 30 years, Hollywood has bought it up and they are producing a kind of big budget reboot of this film that never actually surfaced, right? They have the original script and they pull in this one surviving actor to work on the movie with them 30 years later. So far we have his perspective from the past. So when he got roped into the original movie and some of the weird beginnings of the making of that movie that just lead me to believe something very catastrophic happened with this. I mean, obviously the cast didn't survive, so something happened, but even just in some of the early methods that the directors are introducing him to, they didn't let him read the script before he signed on to act in it. So that's interesting. They make him stay in a different hotel from the rest of the cast. That's interesting. There's some weird things right from the get-go that just make you go, yeah, there was something going on here. And I think we're going to figure out what it was. So we have that perspective. And then we also have 30 years later, as Hollywood has bought it up and they're making the reboot. We also have some bits and pieces of the script that have been read so far. So you're seeing a little bit of what they were actually working on for the film. And I'm sure that's just going to get twistier and twistier because it's Paul Tremblay, and it's fantastic, and it's classic Paul Tremblay. So it's these really compelling characters, these really interesting questions being introduced right off the bat. It's the quick chapters ending on the cliffhangers. It's all the things you want from him. He is delivering. I am excited. I need to slow down because I'm going to finish it by like Thursday if I keep at it at this pace. And I've been looking forward to it for so long. But if you like Paul Tremblay, or if you like horror or any of that like kind of cursed film, found footage, tropey stuff that's becoming really popular in horror novels right now, I think you're really going to like this book.
I think you should just go ahead and read it fast and be done by Thursday, and then bring it to my house, and I will be taking my turn as soon as you're done. All right, so that's what we're reading now. What have you been reading the last month or so?
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I, this past month, read 2 books that are kind of in genres that I don't typically dive a whole lot into. More women's fiction than I normally do. I've dabbled a little bit in fluffy romance in the past couple months. That's been new for me. There's been a lot of hit and miss with that, but these are both more true women's fiction. And the first one is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. This book is wildly popular. The book is amazing. I genuinely loved it. To wildly oversimplify this plot for you, it's a contemporary women's fiction story. It's about a female chemist in the 1950s who gets a deal for her own cooking show. Now, again, wildly oversimplifying it. If you told me that that's all it was about, I would have no interest in reading it, right? Because it's like, that's
right.
That just seems weird, and like doesn't seem like anything I'd be interested in. So yes, on the surface, that is the plot, but really, this is a story with a major emphasis on gender inequality in STEM, with lots of comments and expectations of gender roles back in the 1950s. But also, this book was written in 2023, and so much of it is still kind of prevalent in our culture today. And so it kind of plays on that, right? So as the modern day reader, you're still seeing the reflection of some of these inequalities that still exist, not just in the STEM field, but just in society in general. So this is a book following Elizabeth Zott. She is a chemist. She has degrees in chemistry, but she has struggled to continue to get higher degrees. She has struggled to stay in a workplace that doesn't sign off her work under men's names, or, fire her under false pretenses. I mean, just different things like this. The way I've described it to people is it is a book that is both gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, and also really hopeful and exciting all in one story. And it's just because you're following these different waves and seasons of her life as she has big wins and then big losses and then big wins again. And it's the way that she keeps picking herself back up after all these things. The cooking show thing it's a big part of the premise, even from the get-go. Like, from the beginning of the story that that's kind of where she ends up, that she gets this gig as this reality cooking star. But what's interesting is she's working with these producers that want her to be like the typical housewife of the 1950s, right? So they want her to be pretty. They want her to be perky. They want her to, encourage women to make these excellent meals for when their husbands come home from work and whatnot. And she just won't, right? Because it's just not who she is. She's a chemist, and she loves cooking because she loves the chemistry and the science involved in it. And so she starts using this platform to encourage women to study and to research and to take risks and to actually get out of the kitchen, which is so interesting because it's a cooking show. I just found myself really inspired by the narrative as a whole. I mean, like I said, there were some really, really hard moments to get through, but every time that she would kind of pick herself back up and get to the other side of it, it just was really encouraging. So I really loved this book. I don't think I would have picked it up if it hadn't been like my book club's pick of the month, but I would actually really encourage anyone who's interested in women's fiction to go ahead and give this one a try, because I found it to be a really great read.
I don't know if you remember or not, Jamie Hyde, when she was on with us a year and a half ago, talked about this book. And we had a conversation about how deceptive the cover is and the marketing.
Insanely
deceptive. Because it does
deceptive.
look like the fluffy romance, but there really is so much more to it. I've not heard anyone say anything negative about that book.
Yeah.
What's your other one?
Okay, so my other book is maybe a tad bit more on the fluffy side. It is a book called Landline by Rainbow Rowell. This book came out, it's got to be close to 10 years ago, so it's not super new. This is another one that some book club friends kind of put on my radar. This is a story about a woman named Georgie, and she is a sitcom writer. She's a co-writer on a show that has gotten wildly popular, kind of blew up, but she's kind of over it. Like, she kind of feels like, at least for her, it's run its course. And she is given this kind of huge opportunity that could possibly land her own show. The problem is it's Christmas, and she had promised to spend Christmas in Omaha, Nebraska with her husband and their 2 little kids at her husband's family home. They're from Nebraska. And so she then has to tell her husband, hey, I'm actually not going to go. I've gotten this opportunity. I'm going to work on this show. This could be my big break. Kind of the downfall is that their marriage has been struggling before this anyways. And so her deciding not to go home with him for Christmas feels a little bit like a nail in the coffin. And so she's not sure if when he returns, if they're still going to be together or if this is kind of the end for them. She's obviously devastated about this. She's trying to focus on her work, but that's a pretty big deal, right? And so she finds herself not wanting to go home to her empty house after these long work days. And so she goes to her parents' house and she stays with them for a while. And when she does, she picks up her mom's landline phone and she calls the husband's family landline. And her husband picks up, but it's him from 15 years ago. It's him from when he was in college when they first started dating. And so present timeline her is speaking to her husband from the past. Now, he still recognizes that it's her, not knowing that it's her 15 years later. It's super sweet because basically you're kind of reading through this series of conversations with her husband from the past that are kind of helping guide her decisions about the future of her marriage and where it's currently at. This is a really sweet story, honestly. It's not maybe the most fantastic writing ever. You have to go into it knowing that, like, you're not necessarily going to get all of the answers, and like you may still have a couple questions by the end of it all. But if you can suspend your disbelief a little bit and really just kind of enjoy it for what it is, it's a sweet story about marriage and the ups and downs of marriage in different seasons and work-life balance. And overall, I just found it really like nice and enjoyable.
So I have to ask a question that has nothing to do with this book.
Go for it.
So you mentioned both of these books that are a little bit out of your typical reading.
Yeah.
You were influenced by this book club that you're a part of.
Yes, I am heavily.
My question for you is, are the poor other people in this book club also now reading Stephen King and some of the other stuff you read because you're influencing them, or have you not made that leap yet?
Okay, so excellent question. Very first day of book club, I did kind of out myself and I said, here's the deal. I don't read the things that you guys read, and I want to be your friend and I want to be in your club, but like, I'm going to have some recs that are going to be a little bit out there. Like, how far out there are we willing to go? And we have some members that were like, I don't like horror. Like, I don't want to do the like super gruesome, gritty horror. And I was like, okay, so what we're doing is we're easing them into that. My rec for them, so we've each just given one recommendation at this point. This club has only been going since January. So, we're still new. I recommended Local Woman Missing because it's not horror. It's kind of domestic thriller, got a good mystery, but it does have some darker themes. And so it's almost edging toward horror. So I felt like that could be a good introduction to just the grimmer side of storytelling. And we'll see how they handle that. And then I'll judge if I can throw in some Paul Tremblay or some Stephen King or some, Dean Koontz, something a little bit darker.
It'll be Head Full of Ghosts and It by January.
Yeah. The other problem with some of the things I read is we don't have, 7 months to spend on one book.
Right,
so
right.
I have to reel it in sometimes. All right. So what about you? What have you been reading this month?
Speaking of books that you have to settle in and take a minute to read, my first book, it's called Swan Song by Robert McCammon. This is a book that's on at or near the top of every post-apocalyptic novel list. I've seen it a bunch of times, picked it up once to read it, and then saw, it's 960 pages. I don't have time for that right now because of other things I have to read for the podcast. Well, during the hiatus, I had a little extra time to be reading. So I picked it up, and it's a fantastic post-apocalyptic novel. The problem is I'd already read The Stand.
Yeah.
And I felt like a lot of times, McCammon's read The Stand too. And he's just, and I don't think it's intentional. I don't think he's cribbing it. But, when you get into post-apocalyptic, massive, sweeping epic, you're going to be hard pressed not to end up getting compared. And so I think it suffers a little bit from that. But that said, I still really, really enjoyed it. Quick setup. It's written in 1987. So you got to remember, this is like the height of like The Day After was on TV the year before. Now you're way too young to know what The Day After is, but it was a show about what would happen in rural Kansas in the wake of a nuclear strike on Kansas City. We have a massive nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. All the cities are wiped out. A lot of the countryside is also wiped out because that's like where the missile silos are and military bases and things like that. And that happens very quickly. So you get a little bit of setup of 3 or 4 different characters that are going to survive because you spend time hearing about them. And then the attack happens, and the rest of it is these survivors struggling in this landscape and trying to find their way. They start in different places. They end up coming together. There are the really good guys and the really bad guys, and the inevitable confrontation is coming. So again, you see where I'm going with a lot of this. Feels like Denver and Las Vegas all over again.
Yeah, very much.
And again, there are some things that are pretty similar. You have a disaster. You have survivors in different places coming together, good versus evil. And there's also this supernatural thread that kind of flows through this. So there are some things that happen that scientifically don't make any sense, that are a result of the disaster, but shouldn't be. And I don't want to get too much into it because then that gets spoilery, but there is this supernatural thread that just kind of weaves its way through and shows up in unusual places, but not unusual places in the context of what's been set up. So it never feels like, that's just a cheap way out or Deus Ex Machina, whatever. Like, it actually makes sense in the context of what's going on. But there's also some things that are different enough. And just a couple of those real quick. One is, in The Stand, everybody's a little bit morally ambiguous. The good guys have some bad in them. The bad guys, some of them have some good in them. There's none of that in Swan Song. The bad guys are all the way bad. The good guys are all the way good. Another thing that's different in the favor of this, there's a lot more action, and the action is written a lot better. And the other thing, this is a brutal book. Like, it's tough. He holds nothing back on what that nuclear strike could look like, what could happen, not just to physical entities and structures, but also to people. It's not for the faint of heart. I mean, it really leans into the horror side of post-apocalyptic in a way that others don't necessarily. And then because it's a nuclear strike, you have a world that has lost most of its resources, the air, the water, the soil, all of that's been contaminated. So the struggle is very different, and in some ways is a lot more heightened. So if you're into post-apocalyptic, absolutely read Swan Song. Again, enjoyable. And I think if you recognize it for what it is and can enjoy the genre, you're really going to enjoy the book.
It sounds really good. It's the kind of sci-fi that I can get into, the kind of the darker side of sci-fi, the apocalyptic. I loved The Stand. And as long as it's, my thing with, I'm always fine if a book is reminiscent of another book, or if an author seems like they're inspired by other works. It's hard not to be, right? If you're consuming literature, you're going to be inspired by literature, and it's going to reflect in your own work. It's part of it, right? It only becomes a turnoff for me when you're creating a carbon copy of something else, or at least you're attempting to, but what you're actually doing is creating the off-brand version of The Stand, or, the great value version of whatever.
And I will tell you, like, the beginning of it, I felt a lot of that. And it was, obviously it's a different disaster. But so much of it just kind of tracked in similar directions that I just kept thinking, am I going to keep going? Am I going to keep going? And had enough interest in what was happening to continue on. And ultimately it did begin to diverge. Again, you're going to have the big good versus evil battle at the end. That's not a spoiler. That's every one of these books, but it's different. And again, different enough that I think it stands alone. I think it just also inevitably, because of what it is, a gigantic book about the end of the world, is going to have some comparisons to the, in my opinion, all-time classic in that genre.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my second book couldn't be more different.
We love it. We love a juxtaposition.
we go from bleak and brutal to hopeful and funny, and one of my favorite books ever. I don't reread a lot of things because life's too short, but every 2 or 3 years, I will stop and reread Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. And I actually grabbed the audiobook version. I'd never listened to it, and it's not Lamott reading it, but it's somebody who sure sounds a whole lot like her. And so I think that's not accidental. If you're not familiar with Bird by Bird is one of the classic works for writers. It's 30 years old now, which is amazing to me, because that says something about how old I might be. But it's about writing, but it's all, in fact, the tagline is some instructions on writing and life, because she talks about writing, but she also talks a lot about family and about love and about heartache and about how we treat and think about ourselves and just all this other stuff that is wildly encouraging. She is hilarious. She is honest. She is tough on everyone, but in a way that's really loving. And so one of the classic lines from the book is, you can be sure that you've created God in your own image when he hates all the same people you do. It's just those kinds of things that are just so wildly encouraging. And I will say, I'm not a huge fan of Lamott's fiction, not because it's bad, but just it's not my thing. But her nonfiction, so this book, there's another book called Plan B, another one called Grace Eventually, very much in a, she writes from a Christian perspective. That's her worldview, but one that is different than a lot of folks that you hear or read. But ultimately, it is a book about writing. It's, about why we should do it, how to do it, how not to do it, who to listen to, who not to listen to. She talks about, real pragmatic things like writing groups and the publishing process and what that is and what it isn't. But then she also gets into what your parents put in your lunchbox when you were a kid say about them, because it's just that kind of quirky stuff all the way through. So if you're a writer, if you haven't read Bird by Bird, you should absolutely read Bird by Bird. If you're not a writer and just want something that you're going to feel good about and maybe give you some insight into the writers in your life, then also I would say check out Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. And I have to ask, surely you've read this.
I have read Bird by Bird. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I almost wouldn't even describe it necessarily as a book on writing, as it is just a book on creativity and channeling that based on who you are and all of these different experiences that you've had. And it's so interesting. I didn't realize it was 30 years old. I guess I just didn't know, because it's so applicable still. Maybe a couple things about publishing and a couple of those maybe more technical things are dated, but like a book written in 2015 would also be dated at this point. It's an ever-changing industry. So
last year.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and for those of you, the whole idea of Bird by Bird, she tells a story at the very beginning about her brother who gets caught at the last minute with an assignment. He has to do some project like with 30 birds, and it's due the next day, and he's done nothing. And we've all been there in some way, shape, or form. And her dad sits down with him and he's like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to get it done. And her dad's response is just bird by bird, like one thing at a time, one thing at a time. And I think that theme goes all the way through the book. And man, it's a really kind of encouraging thing. We were talking at the beginning of this, we're getting ready to move, and there's 1,000 things you have to do when you're moving. And I have said multiple times the last 2 or 3 weeks, bird by bird, like we're going to knock it out one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I don't think it's necessarily just about writing. It just happens to be the context for telling some lots of other stories and lots of other encouragement.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you ever need just like, someone providing you with a creative outlet when yours runs out, this is the kind of book for you, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to pause from our normal plan and throw out just a couple of books. So in the Bookcast newsletter that came out in June, if you're not subscribed to the Bookcast newsletter, subscribe to the Bookcast newsletter at okiebookcast.com/subscribe. Commercial over. We gave, I think, 4 or 5 each books that we read during the hiatus that we want people to know about. We're only going to do a couple here for the sake of time. So Hannah, when you think about things you read from late February through the books you've talked about, what are a couple of books that you just want people to know, hey, you should go check this out?
Man, it was tricky because I read some good stuff over this break.
Right.
There was something about I wasn't teaching a whole lot this spring, and I wasn't doing the pod.
Right.
And so I really could just read whatever the heck I wanted, whenever I wanted. And that was awesome. I'm only going to talk about 2, and I'm going to talk about them super briefly. They are on 2 very different ends of the genre spectrum. Maybe somewhere, in the middle, it catches everybody. But fantastic horror book that I read. Maybe my favorite horror book of the year so far. I haven't finished horror movie yet, though, so we'll see. The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. This book came out a couple years ago, and I'm just now getting around to it. Absolutely fantastic horror novel. Now, here's the thing. I was told, when I was introduced to this book, I was told going into it, go into it blind. Don't read anything about it. Don't look anything up. Just trust me, pick it up and read it, and you will be thankful that you did. So I'm going to do something that I never do on this show, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just going to tell you that, and I'm going to shut up. Go into this book blind if you dare, okay? If you have to read the trigger warnings, do that, take care of yourself. But man, if you love horror and you are willing to just kind of dive into something head first with your eyes closed, please do that with this book. You will not be sad that you did. Your jaw will be on the floor for 350 pages. This book was awesome. Something completely different, though, if that's not you, if you're like, I am not going into a blind horror book. Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This was an immediate phone call to my father when I started reading this book. I said, have you read Brandon Sanderson? And if you have not, you have to start with this book. Oh my gosh, it's so fun. It's a high fantasy story. It's a quest adventure type story. I've been describing it to people as a more girl power version of The Princess Bride, if you've seen that movie.
Nice.
It's very, it's that kind of quest, adventure, hero's journey kind of story, but it's Brandon Sanderson, right? So it's witty, it's funny, it's really fun characters, it's the kind of quirky asides that he does. If you love Brandon Sanderson, you are going to love this book because it is classic him. And if you've never read Brandon Sanderson, this is a fantastic one to start with. It's pretty new, but oh my gosh, it was just so much fun. So if you're not into the horror, there's a little high fantasy for you.
Outstanding. I'm going to go the other route because my hiatus reading wasn't great.
Oh, bummer.
Some good stuff, and I'll talk about a couple of things, but it was kind of easy to identify the couple of things I wanted to talk about. And these are going to be if you're into them, you're into them, and if you're not, you're not. So Hannah, I would go ahead and cue your eye roll right now.
All right, I'm ready.
There you go. Thank you very much. The first, and I want to credit J.J. Johnson, and I think maybe Martha Steele. There have been a couple of different people who've told me that I should read Dungeon Crawler Carl. And I hadn't, and just for whatever reason, hadn't picked it up. I was going on a trip in April, I think, and downloaded it, thought this would be great. It'd be an easy read on the plane, and I can read it, whatever. I devoured book 1 of Dungeon Crawler Carl. And there are, I think, 7 or 8 more coming. This is a genre I haven't messed with before called Lit RPG. And it's basically, if you're into role-playing games, it's like a narrative version of a role-playing game. And I won't say much more than that because, again, if you're in, you're in, and if you're out, you're out. Except that if you played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid or played other RPGs, or you play them on, Xbox, wherever you play things, and you like to read, check one of these out because they are all of the things that you appreciate about role-playing games, but they're also hilarious, great characters. They move fast, ton of fun. Like I said, I read a couple of them and can't wait to get into more of them. The second is another series, actually a short series by a guy named Vernor Vinge. Vinge actually just passed away about 6 months ago. The Peace War series. So the first book's called The Peace War. The second one's called Marooned in Realtime. And it's really interesting, near future science fiction, high concept. He's a hard science fiction writer. So it is, the science is there and there's a lot of science to it. Fascinating conversation about war and peace. So, the Peace War, but also about politics, about governments, about what people are willing to do to stay in power, but also what people who are being oppressed are willing to do to get out from under that. And so they're really interesting books. The premise is this technology becomes available to essentially bubble people in for extended periods of time. And so you basically win the war by just bubbling the military base. And then they can't get out and they can't do anything. So much more to it than that, but we say we'd be quick. But yeah, The Peace War and Marooned in Realtime by Vernor Vinge. If you're a hard science fiction person and you haven't read a lot of Vinge, now is the time to start checking him out too.
I could say something snarky, but I won't.
Why stop
I was
now?
gonna say, man, if those were your hits of the hiatus, I don't want to know what the misses were.
You really don't.
Oh,
you really
boy,
don't.
Hey, but I mean, there's something for everyone, right?
We are now at our backlist pick, and because we were kind of lazy and thought about this at the last minute, and because it's just the two of us, we decided that for the backlist pick this time, we are doing an author that we love, but a book by them that we haven't talked about yet. So I think that's the simple way to say it. There was a lot of confusion.
There were some phone calls. It was a whole thing.
Like. Yeah, prepositional phrases sometimes are complicated.
Tricky.
So this is a book by an author we love that we haven't talked about yet. And again, because it's our backlist pick, at least 5 years old. Hannah, what you got?
Okay, so I don't think this is cheating. This was a standalone book eventually.
Here we go.
It originally was featured in an anthology. I am obviously going to talk about Stephen King because I am insufferable. I am a broken record. The dead horse is just going to take the beating one more time tonight. So I want to talk about The Mist because it's one of my favorite Stephen King books, and I don't get enough opportunities to just absolutely geek out over how awesome this book is. So allow me.
Settle in.
So this is a novella about a father and son that have to go to the local grocery convenience store in their town after a storm. There's been this kind of freak random storm that's caused a lot of damage in this small town. So father and son are going to the store to get some supplies to start cleaning up from the damage from the storm. They get to the store and a bunch of people from the community are there doing the same thing. And the community of people end up getting trapped in this convenience store because this mysterious mist has settled over the town. And guess what? It's filled with monsters that kill people when they try to walk outside. How fabulous is that for a premise?
So this isn't the one with the gas station and the trucks, right? That's different.
That's different.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Good try, though.
Thank you.
So I absolutely love this story because, yes, it is traditional horror in that it has some kind of jump scare-ish moments. It's got some scary monster moments, but it's really more psychological and social horror than it is the jump scare, the blood and guts, the monsters. So it kind of like touches on a little bit of everything that I love in a horror story. And it does so in like a very short period of time. Because again, this was a novella. So it's not even a full length novel. And yet there's so much packed into this story. It was, like I said, originally included in an anthology. It was later published as a standalone novella, and then it was turned into a film adaptation. If you have seen the movie, but you have not read the book, and the movie made you maybe a little bit mad or a little bit sad, I'm not going to say why, but like, let's just say, for example, that you didn't love it after watching the movie, you still need to go back and read the book, because the book has a completely different ending, and you need to experience that as well. You also need to experience what's going on in the heads of the characters when they do some of the things that they do, because you get more of that from the novella than you do from the film. So just a PSA, if you've seen the film and kind of wrote it off, no, you need to try the novella too. It's really, really well written. It's great characters. It's a lot of that like great psychological and social horror. There's just a lot happening in a very short amount of time. It's just fun. I think it's all of like the best things that horror can be mixed up into one pretty quick little story. So, man, if you have not read The Mist, please do it. If you don't read anything else that I've talked about tonight, please just go grab this. I mean, it's time. It's so good. Do yourself a favor.
Well, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that when King is writing shorter, there's something about that just, because it is tight and it moves. And it's funny because I have heard lots of people say, who've read the story and seen the movie, that they're mad about the movie. But I will tell you, my buddy Jamie Ray, Faye Five from Fans, who you've recorded with, it's one of his favorite movies.
Yeah.
He loves it, but he also loves the book. So
I think the movie did so many things well too, considering that it was, a feature-length film based on a novella. There's challenges with that as well, but some of the creative liberties taken with it are just vastly different from...
Particularly towards...
Yeah. So just give it a try. Just trust me on this.
There you go.
What about you?
Well, just like you were wildly predictable in your choice of authors, I am probably wildly predictable as well. I, about 3 months ago, started a quest to... so my love for Clifford Simak is well documented on this show. I have now embarked on a quest to get the earliest paperback editions of all of his novels that I can find. And so I see that.
That's
look on
cute.
Your face.
That's sweet.
Stop
That's
it.
nice.
And I have paperbacks from 1948. That's
honestly
cool.
really impressive.
You got to admit that
is pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
Thank you very much. So the book I want to talk about by Clifford Simak is called Why Call Them Back from Heaven, written in 1967, and I do have a first edition from 1967.
Hey, we got a high roller up in here.
Listen, here's the beauty. These paperbacks, nobody knows what they're worth, and they're not worth a lot because people don't know who he is. So I think I got it for like $4.
That's crazy.
That's how you do it. Anyway, Why Call Them Back from Heaven is a little bit distant future, set in 2148. The big idea is that society has decided that the best way to deal with population and just this, question of afterlife and immortality and whatever is, as soon as people die, you cryogenically freeze them to someday bring them back, reanimate them, and away they will go. And this has been going on for a while. There are now 100 billion people who have been frozen, and billions of people still on Earth. But people at a certain point in aging go ahead and take their lives and go be frozen so that they can come back later and be healthy. The book's not so much about that as it is about what that does to a society. And I think this is why you talk about social horror. I think science fiction from this period in the 50s, 60s, 70s is about something. Like they're trying to talk about what's going on in the world in these fantastic universes so that people don't necessarily know exactly what they're talking about, right? It's like, oh, that's a fun thing about spaceships or a fun thing about aliens, but they're really talking about something else. This has a lot to say about government. It has a lot to say about power. It has a lot to say about corporations, because one of the things that's happened, the company that makes it possible to freeze has become basically the Amazon, Walmart conglomerate of the world. Like they've taken over. So every every company has basically folded into them. Governments no longer really matter because everybody's just kind of beholden to this company, because if you do something wrong and you don't get frozen, then you miss out on your second life and you're just gone, right? So the greatest punishment that you can give somebody for a crime is to take away their ability for a second life. And that comes up. But the other thing that it does is people begin to live their quote unquote first lives to make enough money to survive in the second life. And so they all live on basically nothing because they're saving back everything they can. So the other worst thing, the other punishment that can happen is you still are allowed a second life, but you are a pauper. You lose everything. So then you're dependent on the state or whatever. So the story centers around a guy who works for this company who does this stuff, and he makes them unhappy. And the Forever Center not only fires him, but frames him for murder so that he's what's called ostracized. He has a mark put on his face, literally, so that no one is allowed to interact with him. He can't work. He can't make any money. And he's still going to get a second life, but he's going to have nothing when he gets there. And so the rest of the story is his journey through this world of people who are very bought into the way the society works, and then those who've chosen to live outside of it. So there's themes of religion here. There's lots about class, and again, lots about government and power. And it's a fascinating book. And again, novels from this time are short, so it's quick, it's tight, but still has a lot to say. And even if you just want to read it for the entertainment value of reading it, you get that too, because it is a great story. There's action sequences. There's a lot going on. So yeah, I will forever talk about Simak as much as I possibly can, but this is one that was not on my radar. And then when I found it, I went through it pretty quickly, and it's one of the top 4 or 5 of his now that I've read. Again, called Why Call Them Back from Heaven. And if you're into classic science fiction, you need to be reading Simak, and this is one you should add to your list.
I had never even heard of this one before. It sounds awesome. And I think it's really interesting that you said this came out in the 60s?
1967.
67. So even in the 60s, we had science fiction centering around the idea of cheating death. I mean, how many books today do we still have kind of centering around that trope and the downfalls of such things that we're still, as the human race, we're still trying to wrap our heads around and also grapple with the consequences of it. Yeah. Science fiction is so cool in that way, in that it takes these very universal themes that many of which stand the test of time, because you're talking about very futuristic, quote unquote, things that may or may not ever be, but it's all of these like existential questions that humans are always going to ask that are just going to play out a little bit differently as the decades go on and as technology goes on. But because of that, you've got stories from the 60s that are going to resonate with people just as well today in a lot of ways as they probably would back then.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges is that people tend to write off, especially the lesser known. I mean, people read Heinlein, they read Asimov, some of these others that are the names everybody knows, but some of these others that are just a step down in terms of popularity, but not in terms of ability, get lost and forgotten because it's not a name that you recognize. And so why would I read something from then if I can read all these things now? And I will say, as a massive science fiction fan, science fiction now doesn't do this in the same way.
Yeah.
A lot of science fiction is more just about, it's more space opera, and it's, we're going to blow stuff up and shoot and fly through space. And it's not about these bigger themes, these bigger ideas as much anymore, because it's become more of an entertainment medium than I think it was traditionally way back in the day. Yeah. All right. Well, on that wildly heady and existential note.
Yikes.
I know, man. How did that happen? Bleak. All of that to say, hey, that's it for this edition of Your Next Great Read. Thanks for hanging out with us, Hannah. Great stuff as always.
Hey, great stuff as always. So good to be back.
Yeah, we're back. And coming up in a couple of months on our 2nd anniversary of doing this.
That is,
I know,
nuts.
Isn't that nuts?
We have talked about so many books.
We have talked about hundreds of
and we
books.
Have so many more to talk about.
Right. Yeah. Because we're not going to stop. Just so everybody's clear, we're not stopping anytime soon.
There is no end in sight.
Well, remember, You can grab all the books we've talked about in the show notes, and you can also go to okiebookcast.com/nextread. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe, as I mentioned earlier, to the Bookcast newsletter to get all kinds of news and recommendations straight to your inbox. We'll be back next month with a guest, so we're going to get back to the normal format and all kinds of books to talk about. And until then,
go find something good to read.